Many Christians inherit a view of hell that is shaped more by medieval imagination than by the Jewish world of Jesus. And a big part of this is because many misunderstand the book of the New Testament that talks about hell more than any other book, not the book of Revelation, but the Gospel of Matthew. This is quite surprising because obviously Jesus is the primary focus of the Gospel. But Matthew's depiction of hell is actually not a detailed map of the afterlife. Instead, it functions as a prophetic and covenantal warning that is aimed at God's own people. In today's video, we will answer the following questions. Why does Matthew talk about hell more than any other gospel? Why does Jesus use such intense language, such as outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth? And what if these warnings are not about medieval torture imagery at all, but rather we have been reading them through the wrong lens this entire time? In order to answer these questions, we will look at each of the 4 images of hell used in the Gospel of Matthew, and how each of these images has their own meaning in Jewish thought. We will see how Gehenna, Hades, outer darkness, and the phrase weeping and gnashing of teeth were used in Jewish apocalyptic language. By the end, hopefully you will see that Jesus' warnings are real, but they are also pastoral, prophetic, and purposeful. Before we dive into the 4 images, let's first look at a brief background of the Gospel of Matthew. Most scholars agree that Matthew is writing after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, which is a major moment of identity crisis for the Jewish people. Also, Matthew is primarily writing to a Jewish Christian audience. Scholars also argue that the imagery, such as outer darkness, that Matthew uses is actually drawn from apocalyptic symbolism of the Second Temple period. In modern terms, instead of being literal descriptions of eternal torment, these images function like the Old Testament prophets. They call Israel to faithfulness, they confront hypocrisy, and they define who truly belongs to God's people. The first image we will look at is Gehenna. Gehenna comes from a Hebrew phrase that refers to the Valley of Hinnom. In the Old Testament, the Valley of Hinnom was a real place that is associated with idolatry, and it later became a place where people would literally burn their garbage. And so Matthew is using this image of a burning garbage dump to serve as a prophetic warning to God's people to practice righteousness. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus uses Gehenna to warn the disciples about the sins of anger and lust. He says that it's better to lose one of your members than your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna. Later in chapter 10, Jesus uses Gehenna to teach the disciples to fear God and not people by saying, rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. And then lastly, Jesus uses the imagery of Gehenna to confront the moral hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the religious leaders of his day and asks them how, after doing all of these things, do they expect to escape from the sentence of Gehenna. Gehenna is a prophetic symbol of the consequences of rejecting God's kingdom. The second image is that of Hades. Scholars argue that Hades is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew Sheol, which in the Old Testament discussed the realm of the dead, where everyone goes when they die. It is temporary and not final. It also symbolizes the power of death, not fiery torment. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's described like a prison that has gates, bars, and even locks. In the Gospel of Matthew, it's used twice. First, Jesus warns that Capernaum will be brought down to Hades, which signifies a reversal of status and also points to their eventual downfall. While in chapter 16, a more popular verse, Jesus says that the gates of Hades will not overcome the church. Hades is about mortality and downfall, not eternal punishment. So in summary, Hades represents death outside of God's kingdom. The third image is outer darkness. This phrase is used in messianic banquet imagery, where in the ancient world, banquets were held at night with lamps on the inside of the building, and those that were kicked out of the banquet had to roam about in the darkness, and being thrown outside meant their shame, exclusion, and their loss of fellowship with those at the banquet. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus uses this phrase, outer darkness, primarily to show people that they are actually excluding themselves from God's kingdom that will ultimately lead to a loss of fellowship with God. In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus says that the sons of the kingdom, those who were insiders who thought they were safe, are excluded from the banquet. And so again, outer darkness is not about physical darkness in a literal afterlife. Instead, it's about being shut out or excluded from God's kingdom and his community. And the last image is weeping and gnashing of teeth, perhaps the most visceral of the four images. The phrase weeping and gnashing of teeth is paired with outer darkness in the Gospel of Matthew. This phrase is a stock apocalyptic expression used to symbolize regret, anguish, and a bitter realization. It describes the emotional response of those who thought they were insiders, but later discovered that they are actually on the outside of God's kingdom. In Matthew 13, Jesus says that the wicked are judged in the parable of the weeds. Also in chapter 13, the bad fish are separated from the righteous in the parable of the net. And then in chapter 24, the servants who are hypocrites are the ones that are exposed. In summary, this phrase, weeping and gnashing of teeth, is the emotional realization of the loss of God's kingdom. So Gehenna is the prophetic symbol of the consequences of rejecting God's kingdom. Hades represents death outside of God's kingdom. Outer darkness is being excluded from God's kingdom. And the weeping and gnashing of teeth is the emotional realization of the loss of God's kingdom. When you look at all of the four images together in the Gospel of Matthew, a pattern emerges. Matthew is not giving a single literal picture of hell in the afterlife. Instead, he is using multiple metaphors to call God's people to faithfulness, humility, and obedience in the here and now. Now, all of this is not to say that hell is not real or that there is no afterlife. Clearly, Jesus and the disciples believed that there was, and Jesus taught on hell quite often when you look in the Gospels. However, the images of the medieval period that we often have in our minds are not really what Matthew is going after. When we read the four images of hell in the Gospel of Matthew, according to their ancient context, we will see that Jesus' warnings are pastoral. They are real warnings meant to wake us up and call us to a life of faithfulness. Additionally, hell in the Gospel of Matthew exposes hypocrisy. Those who pretend to be one way on the outside, but are really evil on the inside. Jesus uses hell to reframe judgment as justice, restoration, covenant accountability, and the healing of creation. Jesus' hardest words are aimed at those who are complacent and hypocritical, not aimed at those who are sincere believers and are trying to follow him the best they can. In summary, hell is real, but is not about an eternal torture chamber. The judgment scenes in the Gospel of Matthew evaluate a lived faith, not an abstract belief. They also reveal a Jesus who warns because he loves, who confronts hypocrisy to protect the vulnerable, and who calls his followers into a life shaped by justice, mercy, and faithfulness.